my gosh, we're live. You are live. So, my name is Joe Harford. I'm the founder and program champion for Farming to Freedom. And Brandon Flood and I have known each other for, oh my gosh, 4, maybe 5 years. And I just thought it would be a really great idea now that we're getting toward the end of the year. We have, as a program, we've worked with a number of men and women in Huntington County, Pennsylvania, with community reentry, employment, housing, counseling services, et cetera. Brandon has a really unique perspective on the issue of criminal justice reform, community reentry. What are we going to do about second chances, et cetera? And I wanted to have an opportunity to chat with Brandon, not only because he's my friend, but because I think he's a really great resource and really helpful. For those of you that may not know, Farming to Freedom, at this point in time, farming is a metaphor where essentially we work with men and women that are farming looking for second chance opportunities. I was fortunate enough to be introduced to the world of criminal justice reform in 2017 through a program in Texas called the Prison Entrepreneurship Program. I came across this program when I was working on my PhD at Penn State. And then met a lot of really cool people along the way, one of which was Brandon Flood. For myself, never realizing the extent of this thing called recidivism and what does mass incarceration mean. And I think that, for a lot of people, what we've got to be able to do is take a look at it from the perspective of the human being. I know there are a lot of people out there that will probably, kind of be down on what it is that we're doing. I've already experienced some of that bias myself, and have had some people have some not so positive things to say to me about the work that I do. And that's okay, because I came from the suburbs of Philadelphia, so I got pretty thick skin. Doesn't bother me. But the reality is, as we get to the end of the year, we know that the challenge is still real. The population is still large. The recidivism rate is still out of control. And as far as I'm concerned, we're still doing a below C grade job, but that's me. And I also come from the perspective of having never been in the system. I have family members that have been both in state prison as well as county. But obviously, not having that direct experience myself, I lean very heavily on people like Brandon and others that I work with to kind of give me a real perspective of what's up. So the first thing I want to say, Brandon, is thank you very much for agreeing to right before the holiday to do this, because I know you got a lot going on. But I'd be curious if you wouldn't mind sharing with folks what is your perspective? What is your background? When we talk about criminal justice reform, what is it? What has been your experience? What has been your life's journey?
Yeah. Well, yeah, first and foremost, thank you for extending the invitation. This is long overdue. Thank you for your work too. Like you said, there are a lot of different ways to address, and a lot of different prongs and approaches to addressing criminal justice reform. So advocacy takes on many different forms, even in the form of this program here. So I appreciate you for your work, and again for that invitation. Yeah, for me, I would say, my background and experience as it relates to the criminal justice system is not too atypical of most young Black males that grow up in the inner city. My experience was a little bit different, being that I was raised by a single father who was a college graduate, military man, very much conservative for the most part. So I just had a kind of a rebellious spirit in the fact that despite my father having those credentials, and it's where we lived at. Sometimes environment matters, right? We hear the phrase "the product of one's environment." So you can have all of the love and support and tools within the household, but if you're in an environment, you're competing against other interests, right? Other influences, especially when you're competing against your child's peers, right? Or contemporaries. So that wasn't too atypical. Ended up spending, I would say, about 2 years in the juvenile justice system through Abraxas, through Northwestern Academy, a high impact boot camp. And that, obviously that continued up into my adult years as an 18-year-old. Probably about a month after my 18th birthday, I was sentenced to 2 to 4 years for drugs. Served that time up at SCI Chester. Ended up serving that whole 4 years, and pretty much, and I had the mentality, again, part of what drives recidivism is the mindset, right? So me going out there, my mindset was very clear, especially I wasn't going to be on parole. My mindset was, I was very intentional in going back out and committing more crimes and engaging in this illicit sale of drugs. So that's what I did. Ended up subsequently being arrested, this time with drugs and a gun. Ended up getting a 5 to 10 year sentence. So it was during that second sentence that the light bulb came on for me. And again, what was kind of atypical for me, you heard me talk about my father. I had a lot of those foundational tools and skills. So when I was ready to make that pivot, it was an easier process for me, right? I had a lot of those soft skills. I was in the workforce before I knew how to deal with people and communicate. Again, it was just more so that rebellious nature that I wanted to, my pathway to success, I wanted it to be a little bit more conventional as opposed to the path that was my father attempted to lay out for me. So yeah, after those 9 years, that light bulb came on for me during my second sentence up SEI Chester. I always give SEI Chester a shout out. Usually we don't shout out prisons. Prison's a place you don't want to go. But if you had to go to prison, especially in Pennsylvania, and especially in the state system, SEI Chester is leaps and bounds above every other institution because they're very program driven. They also benefit from the fact of where they are geographically. They're in southeastern Pennsylvania, Chester, PA, which is in Delaware County. So they're surrounded by institutions of higher learning. A lot of volunteers came in there. You could never say you were bored as an inmate in terms of outside programming. So for me, that's what I got introduced to: public speaking and debate classes and a lot of engagement with the Temple University's Pan-African classes as well too. So for me, having those experiences, that was actually the first time I met a lawmaker as well too. Shout out to the late Stuart Greenleaf, who
oh my gosh, yes,
yeah, Montgomery County. He was back then. This is 2006. It's popular now for state reps and state lawmakers to go into prisons, but back in 2006, that wasn't too in vogue. And Senator Greenleaf was a leader in that respect. He came up to SEI Chester. Call it fate, or just happenstance. The warden asked me out of everybody at the prison to introduce him. At the time, I was pretty green to politics, so I had no clue who he was, what his role was. So yeah, they gave me some. The librarian gave me some work to do my research, gave him a proper introduction, and when he came up there, he talked, much like you talk about, he talked about the different facets of the criminal justice system, what goes into lawmaking. He was the chair of the Judiciary Committee. He was a former prosecutor, so he really gave us some alternative perspectives about the criminal justice system. Was very candid about what goes into lawmaking. So for me, I knew after that event that I wanted to go into government. I wanted to work in government one way, shape, or form. Being from Harrisburg, I'm from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which is the capital, the seat of government in Pennsylvania. So, that was the perfect opportunity when I came home, and that's exactly what I did. So fast forward, end up getting an internship at the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. Ended up working my way up through the chamber, as a legislative assistant, research associate, executive director, and spent a few years in state government. Ultimately, I did apply for my pardon. I applied for a pardon too, just during my time with the House of Representatives. One of my research projects had to do with clemency. So I had no clue about what that was. So as I was doing my research project, eventually I said, shit, this is something I should apply for, right? So that was my first introduction to clemency, and that did spur me to submit my application. Ultimately, I did receive a pardon from the governor, Governor Tom Wolf, in March of 2019, and then subsequently I was appointed by former Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman to oversee the Board of Pardons. So my experience, obviously, I have a lot of different touch points for what my experience has been for the criminal justice system as a defendant to a policy maker to an advocate. So for me, that's what was helpful for me, and certainly I'm able to kind of tap into what it is that people need the most when they're coming out of incarceration or post conviction. So, to your point, one of the biggest things that I know we'll drill down a little bit more, but I think the most important thing that we can do in the criminal justice system, if we're really looking at addressing recidivism, is tapping into what people are passionate about, right? And being able to connect their passion with a way that they can monetize that or earn a living, right? So to the extent we can do that, and where the demand exists too. And I know that's a lot of the work that you've done and are doing, but that's the most important piece, because if we don't address that, doesn't matter how great a job you get someone, or how quickly you get someone a job. If there's no buy-in from them, if they don't feel like they have a sense of worth in that, and the role and the responsibility that they have, it's not going to last, and ultimately they'll revert back to what they've been doing. So I'll pause there.
So this is not the first time that you've shared the story with me, and I would say that every time I hear it, I learn something new. And always the very first word that comes to mind for me is wow. And, you think about where you were, the journey that you took, the choices that you made, then the experiences that you had. And through all of that, there's a mindset, there's a choice that Brandon Flood made, which was, okay, in the very beginning, the choice wasn't necessarily good. In fact, the choice was bad. Okay. And I've said this to people when we go through program delivery, and even when I interview folks, the only difference between you and I, besides the fact that you're incredibly handsome and I am not, is the fact that I never got caught, Brandon.
Right.
I broke the law. And maybe this will come back to haunt me now that it's in LinkedIn Live or whatever. But the reality is I've broken the law. I just never got caught.
Right.
I think that the other difference is obviously, and maybe this becomes touchy for folks, and that's okay. There's obviously a big difference in the color of our skin. And we know that that is an issue within criminal justice reform and within the system. Okay. I think besides mindset, then, there is what I have found is folks say, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. Right. I had the opportunity to meet a man in Texas. One of the very first times I was inside a Texas prison, sitting down for lunch with an inmate. And I knew that he had been in prison for 35 years of his life. Mm-hmm. And I said to him, I said, why are you in PEP now? Why are you in this program now? And he looked at me and he simply said, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. He had gotten to that place where enough was enough. I think the other thing that's important about what you shared was you're right. We have to figure out sooner rather than later, what is the passion that someone has in order to help get them out of the system and keep them out of the system. One of the things that I often talk about in Farming to Freedom is, listen, all I want you to be able to do right now today is get a job. This isn't your forever job. You got to pay bills. You got to be able to prove yourself. You've got to get some reliability in a track record, et cetera. But let's work on, what do you want to be when you grow up someday? What's the thing that's most passionate about? And I think what we do is we don't assess someone to find that out. Right. We really don't. And, I think that there is something to be said about the work that we do within entrepreneurship training and education. And I'm not saying that everybody that's in prison is going to wind up starting their own business, but there is something to be said about the entrepreneurial mindset and the way in which people look at things and how they solve problems, how they create value, et cetera. So one of the things I wanted to ask you is, so when you take a look at your experiences, what were the pivot points? What were either the activities or the experiences or the conversations or whatever it may have been along the journey that got you to pause and go, you know what, I got to go a different way, man. This is not working.
Well, the phrase you used about being sick and tired of being sick and tired, that certainly applies. I mean, I think too, at the end of the day, doesn't matter how many resources that you make available for people, doesn't matter how much hand holding you do or how much direct hiring you're doing. If that person at the end of the day isn't ready to turn that corner, the outcome's going to remain the same. So for me, I had a similar, that kind of epiphany for me, where it was like, hey, listen, I'm 0-2 here in terms of drug selling. So I'm good at many things, but it seems like this is one of those things I'm not good at, right? Because even in the drug world, there's a lot of variables that you can't control, right? I can be the most non-confrontational and business-oriented and professional drug dealer there is, but at the end of the day, there's other outside forces and things that influence whether or not that separates those from being caught and those that may live to find another day, if you will. So yeah, for me, it came to that point being 0-2, especially with the juvenile stuff. I mean, technically, it's 0-3 or 4. So for me, the one thing I said was, you know what, and especially given my my previous criminal history and incarcerations, they were successive too. It wasn't like I was incarcerated one time and 5 years goes past and I was locked up, within a year each time. So I never was really home for a full 12 months without being rearrested for something. So that for me, that was a kind of a baseline factor for me. I said, listen, I'm going to give myself at least 12 months, 12 whole months of genuinely trying to pour my time and attention into doing the right thing. And then if it didn't work out, admittedly, I said to myself, it doesn't work out. The other shit is the default, right? That's always there, the street life. So, really giving myself a chance, and goal setting, I think is key too for a lot of people being successful. Admittedly, most people who get into the drug trade, they do because they gravitate towards the instant gratification part, right? That fast money, so a lot of folks aren't either used to setting goals or capable of setting goals. So for me, that was something that, hey, listen, I want to really create some short-term goals, some intermediate goals, some long-term goals. So it's like you said, yeah, you're not going to get out of prison and get the six-figure job most of the time straight out of prison. So you have to have those short-term, intermediate, and long-term goals. So yeah, it was really giving myself a chance for those 12 months. And then, like I said, leaving Chester too, I felt like I had a better sense of the world. I would say I was naturally intelligent, but just didn't, I wasn't worldly, So for me, I was still rough around the edges after that first sentence. But coming home from Chester, I felt like even when I first had my internship with the House of Representatives, I didn't feel like out of place. I felt like I felt like I was where I belonged, right? And I kind of thrived in that environment. So that was the first thing for me. And then also, it was about learning how to become a better communicator too, believe it or not. I still like to think that I'm a pretty reserved person when I want to be, but there were times you can get me to speak publicly, right? Or to interface with people that I didn't know, or, step into rooms or situations that are unfamiliar. So I think that's another thing we oftentimes teach soft skills to the offender population and those coming out. I think we undervalue that. There's a big value there, especially because at the end of the day, you can create a lot of opportunities through. One thing that most people either forget or just isn't broached is, for all of my professional successes, I have a GED from juvenile from Abraxas, so but it was so a lot of my experiences either been on a job or kind of self-taught. And especially we live in this digital age where if you can become at least come off as a subject matter expert over the weekend. So a lot of times it's about just getting your foot in the door, and those opportunities then are created or emerge afterwards. So I think that was what was helpful for me. That was my mindset, is I felt like, hey, listen, for what I don't have, maybe academically or credential wise, I can make up for in other areas. And then just straight up work ethic too. That's still a thing that helps to separate you from your peers, especially me first going into state government. One of the things I've seen pretty quickly is there are a lot of lazy people in state government, a lot of people that it is, these aren't, we talked about passion earlier. These aren't people's jobs that people are passionate about. These are just jobs that pay the bills, or that folks have been in. And most of them are just watching the clock, right? Looking 9 to 5, and then also looking at the pension clock too, right? How many years of service they got left. So that was something early on that I was like, okay, this is something that can separate me from my colleagues, is, kind of being that first person in, last person out, going above and beyond. And then volunteerism too. For me, I just wanted to kind of broaden my circle, broaden my network too. As the phrase goes, you are who you hang with. So, certainly for me, you going to hang with people in the past that are either that were into the same stuff that I was into, or that currently are still in the same thing that I was into, it wasn't helpful for me. So yeah, it really broadened in my knowledge base and broadened in my network. And then for me, it didn't take that whole 12 years. 12 months for me to say, okay, I made the right choice. It probably took, in all honesty, I was released from Chester February of 2010. I ended up getting a full-time position for the House of Representatives May of 2010. So it took about 3 months for things to start clicking. And for me, once that happened, it was no turning back for me.
The other thing that I remember that I hear consistently, again, whether I was in Texas or when I did my prison research, I did it Laurel Highlands, and got the opportunity to interview 30 different men and unbelievable stories from 30 different men. And there was a theme not only of, sick and tired of being sick and tired, like we talked about, but also people, places, and things. And the whole idea of that impact, because I think that the vast majority of people don't understand that humans don't wake up and go, you know what, I want to be in prison. The amount of trauma and violence that is perpetrated many times on children or on youth, that is the environment, okay, the places piece of people, places, and things, right? And we have very frank, open conversations with people who come into Farming to Freedom of what is their why are you here? Not the why and your purpose in life, but like, why are you here? Like, what brought you here? And I will tell you, Brandon, I've had people tell me things that are incredibly disturbing as to how they got to where they are. And one of the things that, this is the place where I get pushback from people. Well, you got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and rah, rah, rah. Okay. Let's time out for a minute. What happens when you can't even put boots on and you can't even see the bootstraps? And this is where people say, oh, you're a bleeding heart and you want to sing Kumbaya and let everybody out of prison. No, I don't. No, I'm talking about having a realistic, practical approach. I've met some people, men and women, that they have a phenomenal business mind. Now, it just so happens that their product was narcotics, but at the end of the day, they very clearly understood marketing, pricing, distribution, human resources, etc. I mean, they ran a multi-million-dollar operation. And so for me, it's about, okay, how do we help them take that ability and do something legal? But how do we get the common Joe, we'll use that term, the common Joe walking down the street, maybe not necessarily to change their mind, but at least to pause for a moment and have that conversation that says, let's get beyond pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Like, how do we get people to at least have a conversation about this challenge?
Yeah, it's a good question. Obviously there are a lot of people coming under the criminal justice reform tent now that hadn't been under the tent, 10 years ago, especially when we talk about the business community. But yeah, there's still people out there that are staunchly, I guess I would say, anti-second chance, right? And just cannot fathom the concept of redemption when it comes to someone that previously were convicted of an offense. So yeah, I mean, I think for one of the things that was helpful for me to do that when I was board secretary is, we oftentimes had people who, when we talked about just the subject of crime, that they look towards, we're talking about legislators from whether you're Republican or Democrat, that it's Philadelphia was the primary driver or the entity responsible for crime, right? And that we're talking about pardons and we're trying to extend mercy to all these people in Philadelphia that committed these crimes, where I was able to, this is where you're able to use data to your benefit. And this was certainly on the heels of the opioid epidemic and crisis. And I was able to show Republican legislators in rural areas that, hey, listen, your constituency is being impacted by this, right? Especially nonviolent offenses. I'm able to point to nonviolent, non-sexual offenses. Hey, your constituency is impacted by this. You know, if I'm lobbying the legislature for an appropriation for my agency, I'm able to say, hey, listen, these monies are going to be helpful to making sure your constituency is able to go through this process efficiently, get their lives back together, reduce recidivism, and your counties and districts be able to reunify families. So sometimes being able to frame it in a way where you're showing them how they'll be directly impacted. For some people too, like you mentioned, one thing I learned too, working in government, is that there are different carrots and incentives. They vary when it comes to talking to especially policymakers, right? For some, the moral argument is the more compelling one. For some people, it's the economic benefit. So being able to, we did studies too, where we able to do an analysis and see that people that went through the partner process were able to increase their earning potential and thus be able to contribute to the tax rolls and ultimately be able to create a net benefit for the Commonwealth from a budgetary standpoint or from a revenue standpoint. So, you know, for some people, that was the more cogent argument. And then for some people, it was about talking about the trauma, right? Especially when it comes to a lot of the female offenders, right? A lot of them who are serving time or in the system. There's some that do it of their own accord, but a lot of times pressured in the relationships, right? And trauma. And that's oftentimes they kind of find this, you know, we talk about human trafficking and stuff as well. So sometimes you just have to understand who your audience is and understand what it is that moves them, what they define as incentives, and advocate accordingly. And obviously be able to point to family members too, right? You know, most of us, if we look hard enough, we have family members and friends that have been, you know, we just may not know, right? One of the crazy things, not crazy things, but when I was appointed as board secretary, there were people who I worked in different agencies with years ago who I thought were like, Mr. Rogers, or just kind of like, perfect in every aspect of their lives, that ended up emailing or texting me saying, hey, I have something on my record from 30 years ago, and the reason why I stayed in this agency for 20 years is because I didn't feel like I could compete in private industry because I had this conviction, right? So it's almost like I settled because of that. So, reentry doesn't have one particular face, and I think that's another part too, is being able to convey that folks that are in justice involved, they have many different iterations and many different faces.
So one of the things that, there were a lot of things, but one of the things obviously that kind of really smacked me in the face when I started doing both volunteer work and then research for my dissertation were just simply numbers. You take a look at the US population, we account for about 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's population of incarcerated people are in the United States. Like that's really upside down, man. That's way broken. And then, I'm a Netflix documentary junkie, and had the opportunity to watch 13th and then many other documentaries and really fact-driven shows about the challenge. And so in my little lizard brain, this is the challenge I have. So we have the ability today to launch a rocket into space, land on Mars, and send pictures back that you can look at on your phone. We have the ability in the private sector to send uber wealthy people into orbit. And we have the ability to do a lot of really super cool things through technology, innovation, etc. Right? The human being is pretty super smart. What I can't figure out is, how do we keep having this challenge of, call it 2 million people in the system, recidivism rate that hasn't dramatically, and in my world, when I say dramatically, I'm a 10-point kind of guy. That's dramatic to me. And for all intent and purposes, if you look at the numbers, and maybe people that are working in it would be angry when I say this, but still fail when it comes to recidivism. I don't know, how do we keep wrapping around how do we wrap around this axle? Like, why, from your perspective, why do you think this challenge remains where it is today?
I mean, you talked about the movie 13, the 13th Amendment. Yeah, I mean, obviously there's an industry that's created too, right? You know, some folks refer to it as the prison industrial complex. There is an industry that undergirds it, right? And there are real
Mhm.
people that have real careers and are able to support their families and communities on the flip side. So, you know, I think to your point about dramatic, I think we certainly we should be more ambitious and the outcomes should be greater than they are. But I think the lack of dramatism, if you will, in terms of these outcomes, is deliberate because of those industries. No, I think everyone, it'd be a fair assessment, everyone, whether they work in the system or not, could say that there's significant room for improvement. But I think that's one of the things. It's almost kind of like the similar argument you have with renewable energies and fossil fuels, right? Where you know you're going to supplant one for the other, right? One kind of concept or modality. You know, so that I think that's largely what drives it. Yeah, I mean, there are some, for as many people, as many advocates as you have that are pushing for second chances and fair chance, you have an equal amount that want the status quo to remain for those economic reasons. So, yeah, you know, I think that's ultimately what it boils down to.
So to wrap it up, whether it is um, the amount of staff that you could be given, the amount of money that you could be given, or influence, or whatever the variables may be, and maybe this is not a fair question. Maybe this is kind of one of those pie in the sky kind of things. Realizing that you can't solve the problem, and when I say the problem, and we may view it differently. When I say the problem, from my perspective, is the problem is recidivism.
Right.
I think the conversation around sentencing, et cetera, is separate and distinct on how people get there, right? But what I'm looking at is, okay, when Brandon Flood comes into the system, the goal is to have him not come back in the system, right?
Right.
So that's the challenge I'm looking at. Is nationwide, you can argue at 60 or 63% after 3 years. Okay. So what do you think is the single prong or multi-prong approach that we could take in the United States, or even if we want to just simply narrow it down to Pennsylvania, where we could have that dramatic 10-point swing? I'm not even asking recidivism to go to zero, right? I'd be happy as
10
a
is fair.
business
10
owner.
is fair.
You know, I'd be okay with 10 points, man, because I can do the math on 10 points, right?
Yeah.
So what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned the word earlier, assessment. We need to do a better job at assessing what folks' needs, desires are. Because, you know, just to be frank, there's a certain subset of the offender population that doesn't want the resources, that don't want to change, right? Or
Mhm.
not at that point where they are tired, or sick and tired of being tired. So we need to be more prudent in how we allocate those resources, right? As opposed to just merely checking boxes off to say, hey, we offered this, they didn't take advantage of it, you know, it was accessible to them, you know, et cetera. So being a little bit more deliberate and intentional about assessing folks. You know, I think too what you mentioned about sentencing too. I think there's a lot that we can be, you know, it's a separate issue, but it's something that we talk about, that roadmap to redemption. You know, really a lot of that should be built into the sentence, right? You should know from the time you're sentenced, if you do X, Y, and Z, what that pathway out of the system looks like, right? And that be clearly articulated. Again, if you can see something, you know, at least you can visualize what that arc looks like, the more likely you are to follow that, as opposed to just kind of being in this indeterminate state and not knowing what that pathway out looks like for you. And then lastly, I mean, there's a ton of stuff, but I had to pick three. I think addressing the issue of driver's licenses is key, and I've
Oh my
communicated
gosh.
to
Yeah.
many different administrations, and I'm not understanding why I don't think they just underestimate the impact of this. But really being able to, you know, obviously, and I'm talking about excluding people who have driving offenses, right? You DUIs, or you use the vehicle and hurt someone. But the amount of people whose driver's licenses are suspended for non-driving violations is very significant, and there are many industries out there that in positions where having a driver's license is a basic requirement. Whether we're talking about folks that the logistics and trucking industries, high demand. There are a ton of folks that would love to be able to pursue those careers, or just even just some of your basic positions where they want you to have a driver's license, right? That locks you out of a lot of career opportunities. I know for me, when I came home, I always said, all I need is a driver's license, and I'll figure the rest out, right? Because even if I have to travel 40 miles away to, that to me, that gave me the freedom to really be able to chart my path. So when that's restricted, when you're coming out, you already feel like you're doubly behind the 8 ball. But I would say those are three things that if we really locked in and did something about, we'll be able to at least the 10-point percentage point, and be able to drop it down 10 percentage points. I think realistically, you would be able to yield that outcome.
So if we whiteboard it, we're talking about a different type of assessment when people come into the system.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about more clearly defining during the sentencing the pathway of what that may look like for you.
Right.
And then the real practical one is a driver's license, because you're right. So, you live in Harrisburg. I live in Huntington County, Pennsylvania. I live in Mayberry, which I'm very happy to live in Mayberry. But let me tell you something.
I like that.
We ain't got SEPTA. We ain't got mass transportation.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the Amish aren't running bus lines. Okay. So at the end of the day, when you tell a guy or a gal, and this won't mean anything to you, but you happen to live in the southern part of the county of Huntington, and your parole officer is at the county seat, which is in the borough of Huntington, you ain't walking that.
Right.
And so, when you start talking about, and I hear this from people that I work with, because we work with people both at the state and the county level. And when you take someone's driver's license away, I think that is, that's secondarily to taking away their home.
Yeah.
Because what do they do? How do you, I mean, I've worked with people that have said, listen, I have an opportunity to get this job making $18 an hour, but I have no way to get there because I'm not allowed to drive anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had a conversation with a number of, with judges about this, and it's never a positive conversation, mind you. But it's just like, how do you basically, I get the fact that somebody broke the law. Like, I understand that. I'm not naive. And I know that you're angry. And let me say this to you. I've never been a victim of a crime, Brandon. So I can't, from a victim's advocate perspective, I don't want to forget that part of the equation either. There is a reality that, okay, you have to punish people. I understand that. I really, really do. But when you take away that lifeline called a driver's license, that's debilitating, man.
Right. Well, listen, I think that's what goes into, and I talked about sentencing earlier, as part of, we have to also look, if I had to add this as a fourth, well, I guess I can include this in the sentencing part, is, looking at a lot of these offenses that are on the books now, that do they really serve as a deterrent, right? Do they really, I know in theory, when they were first adopted as laws, they were looked at, hey, this is going to deter behavior, but has that actually borne fruit, right? So if we have these, and if they're not, then we need to reevaluate that, right? Because if anything, it seems to be, in this sense, it's exacerbating things. When someone is convicted of a drug offense that had nothing to do with a vehicle, and their drivers. Now, I know they changed the law prospectively, but you still have I couldn't state the number, but I would say at least tens, if not 100,000 people that are still impacted by this. So, I think that's something that, and then even too, right? You use the example of someone's ad, a job making $18 an hour, even though I might make a lower wage. If I have a driver's license, I can get 2 jobs now, right? Because I'll go from here, do this 18, and then knock this out. So it gives me the freedom and it allows me to increase my earning potential too. So yeah, I mean, I've had some conversations with my congressperson here, Scott Perry, about, obviously I know with the Trump administration coming in and there being a new U.S. Secretary for Transportation. I've tried to engage Pennsylvania on it, and it just seems like there's just a very tepid response, or they'll tell me, hey, we can't do anything in terms of like an amnesty program, that it has to come from the feds. So that's an ongoing conversation once whoever I think former Senator Duffy will be nominated and confirmed. But yeah, I mean, that's a huge thing right there that for a lot of people, you'll see that recidivism rate go down markedly.
I hope so. So three things. Number one, I really appreciate you taking time out of your day, sharing your story and having this conversation. You're right. It's been a long time coming, and I really appreciate it. Number two, I appreciate our friendship because I think that, I remember the time that you and Karen and I had dinner together. And I've said this to a number of people, very down to earth, practical, thoughtful person that I know has the ability and has already demonstrated doing a lot of good within the community. Regardless of your party, I would vote for you. I just want you to know that if I ever live in Harrisburg. And then the third thing, I want to wish you and your family a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And I promise you, now it's recorded forever in the ether, I promise you that after the new year, we'll get together live and in person.
I look forward to it, man, and extend the same thing to you and your family, man.
Brandon, take care, man. Peace.
Hey, man, you do the same.
See ya.